Good evening, and welcome to the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York. I'm Karen Taylor, Program Director of the General Society. This program is supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. I would also like to express our appreciation to Thomas Donahue, our window curator, who has installed a special window display for this evening, and I encourage you to have a look at it if you hadn't seen it already. The General Society was founded in 1785 by the skilled craftsmen of New York City, artisans who represented 22 different trades. These include carpenters, blacksmiths, saddlers, tailors, and silversmiths. Today, this 233-year-old organization continues to serve the people of the City of New York through its educational and cultural programs, including our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, our Lock Museum, which is upstairs for those of you who haven't been here before, and the General Society Library, of course, which you're in this evening. And by the way, you will find membership information on the front registration table. And our nearly 200-year-old lecture series, of which the Artisan series is part of. You will find additional information on the General Society on the blue and white postcard that should be on your seat. Our speaker this evening is Abigail Tulis, who is a sculptor and artist based in New York. Gathering concepts and techniques from her independent studies and travels, she is inspired by classical modes of thought and creates work informed by traditional architecture, Renaissance ideals, and medievalism. And I just want to mention there is some examples of her work in the table behind the seats. Tulis began her career in Tennessee, training as a figurative sculptor at 15. She then moved to New York to study sculpture at the Grand Central Academy and the ICA, and in fact used to be upstairs here for 4 years. She began her career with designing and executing a sculptural scheme for Millbrook House, which was awarded the Stanford White Award in 2017. Abigail spent some years alternately working as a decorative sculptor and traveling Europe while building a personal visual language. Currently, Abigail is developing a body of large-scale symbolist paintings in her Long Island City studio, while expanding her artistic vocabulary by working as a visual creative director for the prog pop band Kitten. She exhibits with the Paul Calilindro Gallery in Chelsea, and in fact, she has just created a show there which opens today. I'm very pleased to introduce Abigail Tulis to you now.
Thank you so much, Karen, for your introduction and slowly spoken and well-enunciated words. So I hope that my lecture tonight will be something that you enjoy and that you can get some ideas from. So as Karen said, I'm a sculptor. One moment, I'm going to fix this screen thing. And I grew up in Tennessee, and if I'm going to talk to you about my trade and about my craft, I think I really have to start, just for a moment, I'm going to go sort of back a little bit to the beginning, where as a child I was always creating, and I was always crafting things, and I spent a long time looking at art books and looking at books of costume and history. And I was very lucky because I was homeschooled, and my parents, they're from European American families, and I was able to travel, and I was able to just study classics. And I'm not starting with an image of my own work. I'm starting with an image that I loved as a child. I had no idea what it was about. It is by Delacroix, and he is a French painter. He's from the 19th century. This is called The Death of Sardanapalus, and I found out later, as an adult, what it was about. It's about this king, and I think I'm not sure if this was Constantinople, but it was a place that at the time in France was considered rather exotic. And this was an ancient tale, and this king was attacked by armies. He knew that he was going to lose. So he had all of his slaves and all of his concubines and all of his horses brought into a room and slaughtered, and then he burned himself on a pyre. So as a child, I loved this painting, and then I, found out the history behind it. But I always really loved images where I knew there was a story, I knew there was a world, and I didn't have to even know what it was, but I was always interested. I was really fortunate because I decided to be an artist very young, and with all the influences that I had from my parents, from all the books that I read and that I looked at, I also had an apprenticeship when I was 15. The sculptor who I studied with, he always encouraged me to sketch, and I was always drawing, I was always sketching, I was always copying masterworks that I loved, and I didn't always know why I loved them, but I would make studies of them, sometimes quick ones like this with a ballpoint pen, sometimes something more like this, where it was with clay. My teacher, Cessna DeCosimo, he studied at New York Academy, and he also studied and taught in Florence, and he was part of the atelier system. So when I was 18, I moved here to New York, and I studied upstairs, where at the time there was Grand Central Academy. I was always very interested in the figure, and I decided to study sculpture because I viewed it as a sort of culmination of the arts. It was something where you're making something that's an image that changes. I later found out that that's also what video work is about, but I'll get into that. I studied sculpture on and off for 4 years. Actually, I dropped out of school twice. Honestly, I was a very bad student because I had all of my own ideas. And I would go to the Met, and I would study at the Met more than I studied at school. And I really felt like what I was being taught never lined up with the things I wanted to do based on what I saw. I loved Rodin, and I loved Michelangelo, and I loved Bernini. And I would just study them every chance I got and try to make sculptures from the model that looked like them. And I really started to realize that you can't make sculptures from the model that look like old masters, because what they're doing is much more than copying. They're creating something. So I started to get very interested in composition. And you can see this is the same sculpture from different views. And here is a sort of similar figure that I studied in the Met. And the way that the body language, the way that the muscles were articulated, I realized changed over different periods of time. So I started studying how the medieval artists sculpted figures and rib cages and how Michelangelo sculpted a rib cage. And I started making compositions as well, not just single figures, but inventing my own figures and putting them into the compositions of my school figures. And I also started to do things always twice. So if I made a sculpture, I wouldn't make it once, I would make it at least twice. Sometimes I would make many small versions, and then I'd make a larger version. So I'm just going through right now some slides of sort of my earlier studies when I was starting to find, to react against the things that I ran against that I didn't like, and to search more and more for the things that I did like, and to find, not just say, oh, I like this, but sort of boil down the essence of what it was about that object or that period or that artist that attracted me and why. And if I could some way not just borrow that, but sort of internalize it and synthesize it. I did a number of studies of the deposition, and I probably drew 20 depositions after different people, and I started to realize that certain figures are always in the same place, and there's a very clear structure as far as how medieval compositions go, because it's really about theology. So I made many depositions at one period, and this is when I started to really, I was wanting to make multi-figure sculptural work when I was in school. And it was really hard to make multi-figure work when you only ever have one model. So I was sort of always struggling, as you can imagine. And I also started realizing that sculpture really shouldn't just be plain. It generally was painted. And we have very many terrible reproductions of what Greco-Roman painted sculpture looked like, so I think we have bad associations with painted sculpture. But I started to realize that that was really not the intention of classical artists, to have something that was plain. So this is a sculpture I did near the end of my studies. It's David and Goliath. It's also a bit of Perseus and Medusa, as you can see. Donatello was a really big influence for me, and sort of the Florentine School. So I was in school, I was struggling a lot, trying to reconcile the things I was being told how to make work, and realizing that I wasn't going to be able to make the kind of work I wanted to make that way. And I really started to build my own system as far as making drawings, making many drawings in different ways, and always setting out to get maybe one particular thing each time I copied something, whether that's composition or whether that's line or shadow. So kind of breaking things down. And I really think that if you want to learn anything, I think if you study that and sort of simplify it for yourself and break things down, I think you can really learn anything that way. So that's what I started doing. Now, this is a portrait I did of a friend of mine. It was a commission. And all of the earlier commissions that I had, I don't know, maybe you've had this before too, but I would do them and I would deliver them, and I'd really almost want to say, like, I'll give you your money back. Like, I'm really sorry about this. But that's kind of what was happening. I was constantly frustrated. And this is a portrait of my brother. So I was just practicing here. But I made many, many, many works like this, and I was just producing a tremendous amount. So basically what happened is I'm having this sort of cognitive dissonance. And I think this was kind of a major theme in my work for a long time. And the more that I listened to the things that I saw, and the more I asked them questions, I really started to build my vocabulary. And it started very simply just with techniques. This is a study where I really was just out to copy the line work because I did not know how to use a pen. And I really did a lot of studies like this so I could try to learn how to use a pen and learn how to make hatching and how to have forms receding back and forward just through line work, and how to go around a form, not just go straight across it. So these are sort of technical things that you don't really think about, but it's weird. I don't know. They don't really teach them in school. They teach you certain things, but this was something that I was just tinkering with. And so, long story short, I dropped out of school upstairs, and I went to the school 2 floors down at the Institute for Classical Architecture. And because I was so interested in composition, it was really great, because I think if you're interested in composition, you naturally become attracted to spaces that are well composed and architecture. And I really loved architecture. And I started to design my own sort of little spaces with sculpture, and I thought about the kind of sculpture I wanted to make and the kind of spaces I wanted it to be in and the kind of spaces that I like to be in. And this started to be really, really important for me. This is ridiculous. It's a Gothic archway with, I think it's George Washington. This was for an assignment. But I was starting to play with a lot of different eras and sort of mix them together and take things that were from Renaissance and mix them with things that were medieval and mix them with things that were Greco-Roman, and sort of see how they fit together, and maybe realize that a lot of other people had done that too before me. When I was studying architecture, I met Peter Pennoyer, and he's really amazing. He took a huge risk on me because I was 20, and I'd never done a serious project before. And he was building a house, his private house, which is up in Millbrook in Dutchess County. It's a very, very beautiful house. It's designed by Gregory Gilmartin. And Peter has a dachshund, and he wanted sculptures of his dachshund to go around the upper part of this 2-floor house. So I had a friend who knew him, and you know how this happens. Someone knows someone else, and they say, oh, I know a sculptor, like, I'll introduce you. And So there I was, and he said, I would like to hire you to make this relief panels for my house. So I don't know, I think I was looking at Arapakis, and I was thinking of all these like floral arrangements, and I designed this for him. And I think the main designer of the house is really horrified, and he was like, I don't think we should do this. Because I really didn't understand. I was just thinking about a sculpture. I didn't really know how to think about a sculpture serving a space at the time. So I had this design, and it didn't fit because it was 2 floors up, so it's like up there basically, that high. And can you imagine this relief if it's that high? It's not super readable. So basically what happened is, hold on. Can I ask what time I started? I'm just trying to time myself. I know, I just want to I think you started about 20 to 7. Okay, amazing. We're on track, guys, don't worry. So this design was not well suited for the space, for the exterior space. Because it was really flowy, and if you put this really up high, it's just not going to read. It's going to be kind of like, these little dots could be cute, but so I decided to sort of rework the whole concept of a dachshund chasing rabbits, and to sort of think about what is a story, basically? What's happening? So one thing that I learned when I was studying at the Institute for Classical Architecture, and this really blew my mind, maybe you guys know about this, but basically ancient Greece, Praxiteles, these guys, they designed sculpture to have 7 main viewpoints. So basically this means that the sculpture was against a pillar or a podium of sort, because usually they were, I guess they were mostly in temples. And there were 7 points at which, if you saw it from these 7 points, it would make a perfect composition. But each composition was different, and it would tell part of a story. So I'm going to illustrate this weird, but there's a sculpture called Dominus, and you may have seen it. There's copies of it in the Met. It's very famous, but it's like a guy standing like this, and he has his hands like this. Do you guys know this one? Maybe? Well, there was supposed to be a ribbon in his hand, so what you see now is incomplete, but this sculpture, from each of the 7 viewing points, his face is framed in a different way by his arms and by the ribbon. And the really cool thing is that the ribbon is what they gave basically an Olympic athlete. And they believe that when you won the Olympics, you became a deity. So here's a sculpture of this young man, nude, tying a ribbon around his head, and he's becoming a deity, and as you walk around him, you see his transformation. So what's really cool is that Bernini basically took that, and he boiled it down to 3 points, because as you can imagine, if you have 7 points, it's a lot to fit into one sculpture. You can't really get too dynamic. Things have to be a little bit straightforward. So Bernini with 3 points, you can twist it. You have only 3 points that are main viewing points, and that sort of corresponds with a story. If you guys have ever written a story, you have to have beginning, introduction, sort of, and then you have the climax, and then you have resolution. So Bernini just boiled sculptural composition down to these 3 points. And I decided to make a sculpture for the exterior that related to these 3 points. So I was playing with these ideas, and what I decided on was starting from the right to the left. I also made maquettes. I'll get into that. Starting from right to left, there would be a dachshund jumping, a rabbit jumping, and then the dachshund resting. So the really great thing is that the sun would rise over here, and the sculptures are facing north. So the sun's rising, the sculpture starts this way, it's the dog jumping in the morning, and then at midday, depending on if it's summer or winter, it can be in full sun or it can be in shadow. So at midday, it's about the rabbit, right? And the rabbit's sort of at the peak of the composition. And then at dusk, the sun would set on the resting, of course, very triumphant dog. So I borrowed some dachshund, I borrowed some rabbits, not at the same time, and I drew them a lot. I made models, I made small studies, and I decided to do this project once the main design was approved, I decided to actually sculpt it in my hometown in Tennessee, because I figured, I've got to figure out a lot of stuff right now, and this way, I don't have to worry about cooking or anything. I'm just going to go home. My mom's going to take care of things, and I'm going to just sculpt and look at things from as many different views as I can, and try to just figure out how in the world I'm going to make this read from 30 feet below, or I don't actually know how many feet, but way below. And so I set up an outside setup. This is me sculpting it, and it's really beautiful in Tennessee. I set up an outside setup outside of my grandmother's little house, where it was completely corresponding to the way that it would be installed in the house. And I would work on it for an hour or so in the morning, an hour or so in the afternoon, an hour or so in the evening every day, so that I would really get a feeling for the different times of day and how it affected the different pieces. And I even at some point put them up on my parents' deck so that I could view them from below. And this is a bit of an upgrade, but here they are. And what I found out, and I'd read this before in a book about sculpture, but it's funny, you read things and you're like, yeah, okay, that makes sense, I guess. And then you're doing your craft, you're doing something, and you just can't figure out why it's not working, and then you're like, oh, that thing I read 4 times and thought I knew what they were talking about. But basically with relief, I'm going to go back for 1 second really fast. With relief, you have to really it's like a plateau. So if you're imagining it flat, it's like you have a plateau and sort of a mountain and then the base. And if you make things round, which is sort of our tendency to do with sculpture, you imagine the light comes down and hits a ball, it sort of grazes over it. So to make a relief that reads really well from below, I figured that I have to actually make very clearly 2 planes only. And the relationship between the 2 planes, if it's like this, that's like a hard line in drawing. And if it's like this, that's like a medium line in drawing. And if it's very smooth, that's like a little bit of shading. So I kind of gave myself 3 values, and I gave myself 1 basic plateau, and how that plateau goes into the background determines how the image reads from below and how it reads from far away. So luckily that worked out, and they were very happy with it, and you can see it reads even from far away. You can see a little bit of the gesture that's flowing along the side of the house, and it sort of brings you from the front of the house, and you drive by it down the drive, and you go down the back of the house. And as the sun rises and the sun sets every day, this chase scene is kind of always reenacted over and over again every day. So I'm really interested whenever I do work for clients to make something that is always unfolding and that they can always find something new to see in every day. I'm not interested in making work for my clients, especially if it's so permanent as architecture that's just, you look at it a few times, the more you look at it, the more mistakes you see, or the more you're like, whatever. I guess Peter thought that as well, because he hired me then to do interior sculptural scheme for the tribune of his house, and I'll show you what it looks like in a moment, but I want to just say really quickly that I'm always drawing a lot of things, and I'm always going to museums, even when I'm working on projects or whatever's going on. And around the time when I was kind of trying to figure out this scheme for the interior, he just said, I think we should do something sculptural for this space. And it's a 2-floor space. You come in, you look up into this 2-floor space, kind of like this, but way smaller. And they were supposed to go kind of above where the columns are right now, that. Imagine something very small, but that sort of space. So if we had one idea and then we decided it wasn't good, and I was looking at things. I was in Italy for a little while, and I saw these tondi, they're round, and I really like circular compositions. And it's kind of curved out a little bit in the center, and there was a relief in the curve, but it sort of hollows out. And I really liked this. I just remember seeing it in Rome, and I really liked it. And we were trying to solve this problem, and then all these things that I'd seen sort of came to me, and I said, why don't we just do two tondi, they're facing each other, and they have this mythological scenery. And I just seen this, I copied this, it's is where Paris decides between the different goddesses which one he's going to give the golden apple to. So I just copied this and I said, let's just do something like this. So I made a little presentation drawings of different ideas for different compositions, and they're all based on Greek mythology, and I just read The Golden Ass. I don't know if you've read it, but it's really funny. It reads like a modern novel. It's very bawdy, but it's one of the earliest novels that we have from the Greco-Roman period. And so I did a lot of sort of Bacchus scenes, Dionysus. There's the Marriage of Cupid and Psyche in there, which is a composition I've been very interested in for a while. And Peter chose 2 compositions, and I started to make little models of them because I still really, honestly, I never really know what I'm doing, so I'm always experimenting. So I made these little models experimenting with depth, experimenting with gesture, and to see what was going to feel good. And I decided these were the 2 that we went with. The one with the figure in the center is Dionysus, and the other one is based on that sketch I first showed you. It's the Decision of Paris. So I made little models, and then I made a full-size one, and I brought it up to his house, which was at the time it was completed, and I pasted it up on the wall to see if I liked the size, to check proportions, and of course this whole process is really it's a collaboration, but I was really lucky because Peter gave me a lot of freedom. Basically, he would just say, I think this looks good, maybe work on this, and then I just go and I just do it. So I made this sort of model, and then I built them up the same way, where I sort of had 2 planes, and they're sort of carved out. And here you could see in my studio, it's always a mess because I'm always working on a lot of things. And this is the finished one of Judgment of Paris. And here is the one of Dionysus with Menaids. So Menaids are characters that are sort of constantly in ecstasy, I guess. And here they are in the space. So this is what I was saying. It's sort of, you see it from the second floor and you see it from the first floor. And they sort of answer to each other like medieval sculptures. One of them has like a very outward composition, and one of them has like a composition that draws you in. And I think reliefs and paintings and drawings, whenever they're on a wall, they're like a doorway to another space. So I really wanted this to be something that gave gesture to the wall, but also you could travel into, and maybe it could take you somewhere else. So here they are, and they're flanked by some other sculptures of Peter's collection, and that's about their thickness. There's Dionysus. And there it is from the ground floor, so you're kind of looking up at it through, I think it's called an oculus, right? Is that, I think, the term? Or maybe not an oculus. And there's a ley light, so it has really beautiful natural light. And that's sort of its final state when you look up at this space. So it's a really gorgeous space, and I feel like my work it looks way better than I thought it looked because it's surrounded by such good architecture. And that really does a tremendous amount, I think, if you do work and it's next to something good, it elevates it, and if it's next to something bad, it sort of can degrade it. So I think, putting your work next to certain things is really important. So I'm just going to sort of flip through some things right now. Here's another design. I did this for Katie Ritter, and this ended up not happening, but this was just a design for a powder room. This was another design for a powder room that did end up happening. Here's the final result. So this is sort of like a tiled bas relief, but I sculpted them all by hand, and they're all sort of different. They have like these little waves to them. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit now. The professional work that I've done as a sculptor, I did a few projects, and I really started to feel like 2 things. I felt like I needed more personal vocabulary for what I was trying to do, and I had a lot of visions for things, and I wasn't really sure how to connect those visions to the kind of work I was doing. And I also really started to feel like, as a woman in an industry that was pretty much all men, I needed a lot of protection. And so I sort of psychoanalyzed this, and it's sort of a joke, but I got really obsessed with armor. I started to draw armor at the Met, and I started to draw it a lot. I drew helmets, I drew them in different medium, I got yelled at by the guards. And at the same time, I also started to draw bugs, and I drew a lot of bugs, and I started to realize that armor and bugs are pretty much the same. I think that people who designed armor were looking at bugs a lot because the way the joints fit together, the way things are protected, sort of exoskeletal, it's really incredible. And I think another thing that I really was interested in about armor is that not only is it protective, it's figurative, but it's not too figurative. It's kind of abstracted. You can take it in a very abstracted way, or you can really use it as a base, as a platform for decoration. You can make things look like other things, which can be really fun. This is a helmet that looks like a lion's head. And of course, what ended up happening is things started to get a little confused. And I started to sort of imagine people in the armor. And more what ended up happening is I just realized that I needed to draw armor and bugs and armored bug people. And so this is what I was doing. I was in Europe and I was in New York and I was drawing a lot of armor. And then I, of course, was also sculpting, and I realized, okay, I need to sculpt the armor too, and I need to sculpt my ideal man in the armor, because what else would you do? And I made this sculpture. This is based on many different pieces that I saw that I sort of started to put together. And I had a lot of fun. And also during this time period, I was listening to a lot of rap. I'm not sure what that means, but mostly my diet was Kanye West and Childish Gambino, which are two rap artists. So I think there was like a very aggressive feeling that was happening, and my work started to be completely personal, and I started to not do anything else for people for a while. And that was kind of something that happened organically, because every time I got a commission and I finished it, I would just go off to Europe. So here's this soldier. I call him the ideal Southern soldier, and he's sort of like a hired soldier from the Renaissance, you know. He's probably an asshole. And there he is in my studio. And I started to get some commissions to do the sort of work I wanted to do. So this is a study for a commission of a soldier for the C.S. Lewis Institute. As you can see, I made many studies, and I sort of tried out a lot of different things. And here's the final one. The landscape is the landscape I was living in at the time. It's outside of Utrecht. It's in the Netherlands. It's very beautiful there. And the armor, they're pieces from the Rijksmuseum. And the face is the face of my little brother, who at the time was badly wounded, training as a Marine. I really fell in love with the Dutch landscape, and I started to make a lot of landscape paintings. I'd tried landscape painting before, and I thought, this is really dull. I'd much rather sculpt. But something about the Netherlands is very magical. And I also started to travel much more. I started to draw a lot of architecture, a lot of decoration, doorways and spaces and portals that just I found very magical, and I wanted to live in them, and I wanted to capture them in some way and take some piece of them with me. I think so often today we live in a consumer culture. We want to own something, and we just take a picture. And for me, this is just, I guess I want more of it than that, so I'm always trying to draw things. I traveled a lot, and I drew the whole time, and I amassed a tremendous amount of drawings, and these sort of became like my stockpile. So whenever I need something, I go to my pile, and I look for it. And usually I find it, and usually I find something else that also solves a problem for another project I'm working on. So this way, it's kind of like I started to have all these things, and I can always solve my problems. And I started to feel like I was making work that was the kind of work I wanted to make, but it was just a beginning because I only made really small things. And I would have a little satchel, and I would have a little board, and I'd have these papers, and I would just like trek around Italy. And it was amazing, and I want to romanticize it, but it's also really brutal. So this is what I was doing almost every summer. This is the Rijksmuseum. And this is, of course, Michelangelo. I did this to study composition. And this is after Raphael. This is in the Vatican. And I made this drawing because I loved his line work. It's very elegant. So I lived for a while in a very small medieval town. I did a lot of portraits of people there, and they're all really lovely, and I got to know a lot of them. And I started to do portraits of my friends, and this sort of became a thing. And then, of course, I also went back to a soldier, and I made another soldier. This one was about the Dutch landscape and about how the landscape there is very protective. On his armor, I made scenes from the dike that I had drawn. And I have the original drawings for these back there, so you can check them out. How am I doing on time? Sorry, I'm terrible. I have like 15 more minutes. Is that okay? Okay, cool. So here I am sculpting. He's a little bit larger than life size. And there he is wrapped up. And when I make these sculptures, I really do live with them. I feel like very attached to them. I get very close to them. And here he is hollowed out. This is the process that you have to go through in order to fire it. And this is one of the scenes that I painted and put on him later on. So I kind of came up with a method of using different colored clays and like inlaying the clay on top of the red clay. So it's not really painted, it's kind of like an inlay. And here, this is my studio, and you can see the designs for the armor. So I designed each part of armor. I remember being in the middle of this project and just thinking, what in the world have I gotten myself into? And I just kept on going, and it took over 2 years, and I was back and forth between the Netherlands and New York, and this is when it was finished. It was fired, and it has little golden studs on it now. And here it is on my bed in its different parts. This is a little mouse from the Netherlands. They're very cute, and they're all over the place. And this was the studio I was living in at the time that I completed it. And it's the one that's in this medieval town. So when I lived in the Netherlands and when I was doing this work, I started to make larger work. And I started to take all the drawings that I had done when I was traveling and to find the ones that I was most drawn to, something like this. And I started to play with it in different ways, to draw it in different ways. And then I would turn it into something very large like this. Actually, this piece is on display right now. I just hung it up yesterday in a gallery in Chelsea, so just not trying to plug it, but so you know. Many of the pieces I've done are starting to sort of form a cohesive body, and that's when I sort of realized and started to choose my themes based on not only what I was interested in, but forming a body of work that had a cohesion to it. So processions were very interesting to me, and I did a lot of things with processions, and I'm still exploring a number of compositions with this sort of celebratory idea. There's a lot of figures, there's a lot of stories happening in it, and it's kind of unfolding the same way a novel unfolds. My main goal in my work is to give people the experience similar to the experience I have when I'm reading a really good novel. And I think that when you're transported to another world, and you don't have to think about anything that you're worried about, but you can really just be present, and that it doesn't have to be imagination. I think often it can be based on our memories and our desires. And I think there's a lot about sort of a collective conscience that when you're trying to make something beautiful, whether that's written or whether that's a painting or a sculpture, I think something that's often very beautiful is something that many people will be able to relate to in a lot of different ways and a lot of different levels. So in my work, what I'm always trying to do is to see my work in many different ways. I'm trying to see certain themes from many different angles, and I'm trying to see my work literally from many different angles. I'm always sort of moving it around. I'm always redoing it in different ways. This is another sort of armor piece, but I designed the frame and I painted it. And this is another one. So I think the whole idea of this world, I started to get very, just a literal portal where you can enter through into a world. So that has to do with framing. That has to do with not only the image as a picture plane that you step through, but what's framing it. And it's very similar to architecture. It's just sort of like a smaller version of architecture in a way. These paintings are actually done by a very good friend of mine, David. So I started collaborating because I love to do many things, but I also really love to work with people who can do things in a better way than I can. And he is an incredible painter. So we came up with these designs together for frames and paintings. And we haven't made them yet because I have many plans. But this is one of the things that sort of is in the pocket right now. Here's just a drawing for how some of the drawings and sculptures I was making could be installed. And this is a show that David and I curated together in my own studio space in New York, with his paintings flanked by my sculptures. I was really fortunate to have the opportunity to study printmaking a few years ago at a place just also in Midtown, Manhattan Graphic Center, and I started to make etchings, and etchings are really great because you make these lines that are like a solid thing. You can print many things from them, and you can make many prints, and you can change the character by changing the color. So when I started printmaking, it sort of sped up my process a lot because I could try out a lot of things on one image. And it started to help me figure out how to put my finger on a certain vibe that I was after, on a certain aesthetic, and how to redo things and how to be very free with how I conjure up a space and how I conjure up a mood. And that's really what I'm interested in doing in my work. I'm interested in conveying that. So here's just like a drawing that I had, and then I was able to make it into an etching, and then I can print that etching many times and color it as many ways as I want. And as always, I was copying. So this is a Picasso. First I drew it, and then I reproduced it through etching techniques, and I printed it like this. And here's a soldier composition. And then I made a print. I printed it first like this, and I only have half an image, but I also made one like this. So I changed the same line work, and I made it many, many different ways. Here's a drawing. Actually, I started also to do erotic work around this time. I guess things got really personal in my work, and I thought personal includes everything. So I started to make some sort of erotic bug drawings. Sorry, guys. This is the only one I included, I promise. And this is just a sketch, and then I made it rather large, so I started to make all the ideas I had. I wanted to make them large so they can have power over space. And that's how big it is. And here's another one. So I have all these characters, and they're in this world. And I'm not going to say it's ideal or a dream world, but it's something a little bit off. It's something that makes you look twice. It's something that is shifted in a way where you have to be inquisitive, and you have to ask yourself, what's behind this? And I am always drawing from my own library of images, so this image becomes that. And here is a little beetle. He's going home right now. And here's a moth woman. She's taking a bath. And I really love taking baths, so this is kind of about the pleasures that we enjoy, just those quiet moments. And here it is. It's quite large. It's about 6 feet long. Sorry, I need to end, right? Are we okay? Okay, I'm getting close, so. This is just another one, sort of a riff on a classical painting. And I think that today in our politics, we interpret things probably very differently than used to be interpreted. So I thought this was kind of fun for that reason. Of course, this is after a Goya. This original is in the Met. And I don't know, I think it's I just wanted to make it my own version. Somehow when you add bugs to things, it gets always more interesting, even if people don't notice. And this is the Boom Boom Room. This is the top of the standard. It's a really fun club to go to. And still I'm playing with portraits. I'm always doing portraits of my friends. This is a singer who I met in California, and she posed for me at my studio here. And this is my grandmother. And this is a friend of mine, also who lives in New York. She's a banker, but she always wears really bright, colorful clothes. So, what I'm doing right now is I'm developing this body of work to a very large scale. I take all my studies, I make them many times. I figure out if I like them enough to go on with them, and then I sort of blow them up really big. I do everything freehand. I build layers with watercolor, with ink. And I guess I'm most interested, more even than in technique, I'm always interested in the mood of something and how to capture that. This is a club scene. I'm going to finish with some of the other work that I've sort of got myself into, which is I'm working with this band called Kitten. Some of them are here right now, and they're super supportive of all of the work that I do. But I also have always taken film pictures, so I never consider myself a photographer, but I've started to become a photographer as well, and I shoot everything for them on film mostly. I travel with them, and I shoot their shows, and this is their single cover that I designed for them. And this is a show. This is shot in black and white film. And here we're on the road. And of course, all of these things are working their way into my own work. This is a girl who we met in California, and I took this photo of her on film. And my art influences are always helping out my photography, and the things that I experience as I'm taking pictures are always working their way into my paintings. I also ended up directing a music video for them, and music videos are very interesting because I guess they're a lot like sculpture. They're about your experience and the mood over a period of time instead of over a period of space. And I made these film images, and I play around with things that they could use for different album covers and how to use different materials in a way that's convincing. Of course, this is rather different from my other work because this work is meant to be consumed more quickly. Most of it's for social media, and I think it's very interesting, it's very challenging for me to make work that is supposed to be much more catchy. And I'm gonna just end with something that I want to do in the future, which is I'm very interested in window design. I don't know why. It's like armor and everything else. I started to make a photo series of people designing windows in the high-end stores on Madison Avenue. And the really cool thing is, if you can't afford the stuff in there and you look in the right way, you can wear the things in the reflection. And I designed some window designs sort of with this concept of looking in windows or being reflected in windows. So these are collages with paint and film pictures. So this is the last image, and I'm just going to end with this. Thank you so much for listening to my lecture. It may have been kind of rambly, but I don't know if you've ever heard the story, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie. The image I started with, this is a design I have. It's based on that image, but it's Kanye West and Kim surrounded by their entourage. And it's going to be the same size as Delacroix's original. It's going to be 16 feet by 13 feet. It's the exact size of my studio wall. So if you give a mouse a cookie, he wants a glass of milk. Maybe you read this to your kids, but the story is this mouse, all these different things happen. One thing leads to another, and at the end, he cleans the whole house, and then he's reminded of something, so he makes a drawing, and then he is very tired, so he takes a nap, and then he wakes up from the nap, and he realizes he wants a cookie, so the story ends the same way it began. And thank you so much.
Will you take some questions? That was absolutely fantastic. So thank you. But I'd like to take some questions from the audience.
Tulis, well, it's three short ones. How did you come across the initial image that really you love to study as a child?
Okay.
Number two, why did the guards...
Wait, can I just do one at a time?
Sure.
I'll give short little
Yeah.
answers. The initial image was in a book by a nun that my mother had, an art history book. And I remember being 5 or 6, and I always loved it. And I forgot about it until a few years ago.
Okay.
So, yeah.
All right. And you described Italy as grueling. Just to elaborate on
Why
that.
is it grueling? I feel like a kid in a candy shop who is living in the candy shop. And then, the candy's really good. And then after a while, you're like, whoa, I ate so much candy. And that's not to say that that's a bad thing, but it feels really overwhelming. When I'm in Italy, I just feel like I have to draw, basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the third is, why did the guards yell at you?
Oh,
At the Met.
well, I don't know if you guys have ever tried to draw in the Met with ink, but it's not allowed. So a lot of my collecting of ideas I like to work in ink, and many, many museums don't allow this, so I always have a problem. Not always, but generally. So this is just something that comes, you never think about this, but it just sort of comes with, trying to draw in museums. Thank you for clarifying those things.
Right. Have we any other questions? Okay.
I wanted to know the size of the circular reliefs at this.
It's 3 feet. It's 3 feet in diameter, yeah.
So we have a question at the back. I'll go here and work my way.
I was wondering, in terms of your traditional training and technique, whether you ever first worked in lost wax and then the clay, or back and forth, or casting plaster and then did a bronze to the next level, or?
No, this is actually a really good question. So I think this technique is mostly suggested for when you're doing like coinage or very small relief. Actually, the process of casting and mold making is very tedious, and it can be very expensive and very time consuming. So I'm generally interested to try to get the sort of work I want as in the initial stage, I guess.
Even your sculptures, or especially your assignments, that nobody ever wanted to do the negative, positive casting in bronze to make it lasting or more extended production?
So all the reliefs that I did for the house, I did make molds of them, and I did cast them. They're cast in, it's like a fiberglass reinforced resin. So they're very solid, they are weather resistant, and they're very light. So I do mold make and I do cast. I don't mold make and cast to get, I do it to get sort of the piece in a different material, but I don't do it to sort of check I think it's often used to check something when you're making, sorry, this may be very technical, but when you're making small things, you often can carve back and forth. So you make the original in clay, then you do the wax, and then you fix the wax, and then you make another mold, and then, do you understand what I'm saying? You go back and forth. Mm-hmm. So I don't use this process. I do just mold make to get it in a different material. But I haven't actually worked in bronze. I'm very interested in working in terracotta because I like the feel of the artist's hand in the clay, and I like the fired clay. So sculpturally, that's my medium of choice.
Well, actually, they have founders. Even the greatest artists have founders they hand it off to, and as a sustainable model, as a professional artist, you could release limited editions and then destroy as they do the original cast. No?
Yes, no, that's absolutely true. No, I'm definitely interested in that. I haven't done that as of yet. I've done all my own mold making and all my own casting. So.
Oh, okay, thank you.
At the beginning, you were talking about looking at some of the other, particularly as you're dealing with sculptures, their work. And you said you couldn't quite just draw it because you didn't feel what they were expressing in it. And I was curious in terms...
Wait, can you repeat that really quickly?
Yeah, you were drawing some of at the beginning of the lecture, you were in the museum and you were talking about looking at the sculpture and you were drawing it, but you couldn't quite recreate it because they had a feel that they were bringing out in it. And as I was listening, and I remember I was at a museum not long ago where they talked about, he looked at the stone and felt what he was creating in the stone, and he had to just bring it out.
Yeah.
So I was curious in terms of what you're doing, whether you see it as envisioning it, or whether you feel it and then express it, or both. And has there been an evolution in you?
I think both and an evolution. I do often have a vision, but I think oftentimes I've realized it's much more an emotional feeling of how I want it to feel, as opposed to how I want it to look. How I want it to look kind of develops as I try out different alleys and see if it fits or not. So, yes.
My hobby is photography, and I find your way of working very inspirational, and that you do take the time and you are willing to be frustrated, you know. So I really appreciate that, and it's so that I can remember, hey, Vivian, hey, it's okay. You're not all over the place, but your technique goes from one to the other. I just want to know, in terms of your career, I mean, how you make a living. I mean, like the agent, what would they say you do? Do you know what I mean?
Well, I'm a terrible businesswoman, so maybe that partially answers your question. I'm very interested in the kind of work I feel like I need to make. And I have, maybe it's a very foolish trust, but it's gotten me so far so good that if I make the kind of work I want to make, and if I'm always really trusting my intuition and my goals, that I will be able to be paid for the work I want to make. And that's actually how it works. And it can definitely be feast or famine. But like I said, it's not really, I know this is probably not the right thing to say, but I'm not really worried about it, actually. I'm much more worried that I'm not going to be able to express what I want to.
So your work is in Chelsea. Do you just have one piece there? And what's
no.
the name of the gallery?
The name of the gallery is Paul Calandrillo. It's on 27th Street between 10th and 11th. And Calandrillo, yeah. Actually, if you want, you can come up afterwards and I can give you a little, I have little note things for it. I actually have 11 pieces in the show, and it's a show that I've curated. I've designed the whole space. I've made an installation in the space. And it's work of my work and friends of mine who have been very influential for me. So, yeah.
This will be our last question.
Well, I think this kind of the discussion kind of segues into the what is the school called? The final name of the successor?
Central Academy?
No, here.
Oh, the Mechanics Institute.
Well, I mean, it's the long-term
Yeah.
growth and sustainability of the organization is because you're the artist, and art is somewhat different than creative aspects of trades and crafts that New York has. Traditionally, the artist is conceptualized, and even many sculptors that I know as a collector, they don't even touch the material or the process. They get fabricators to do it. And here all over New York, and even in finance, in terms of people that back or fund the bronze casting, you have all these skills and crafts in Long Island City, all over, people that deal in marble. And his question is about, it's really the stone. Most artists will say the stone reads them as different than clay or other materials. But here, in terms of how the institution can perpetuate itself and work within the parameters of the city and its evolution, the artist is the one that conceptualizes things through trends and time, and the industry meets the needs to fabricate one way or another, one medium or another, even technology, or if you go to any of the big art shows, or mixing glass with technology and all kinds of new mediums that aren't even here yet, So anyway, that's.
Thank you.
Tulis, that was absolutely fantastic. It was your eloquence and your explanation of your process was absolutely fascinating. And one thing I feel 100% certain, that you're so talented, and we are so fortunate to have you here at the beginning of your career. And I know whatever you choose to do, you're going to be immensely successful. So really, thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you, Chloe.
And talking about presentations, we would like to make a presentation to you, and to do so is Victoria Dangle, our Executive Director.
Oh, sorry. I'm so
So, Tulis, yes, that was wonderful, and you are at the outset of your career. And I need to correct you, though. You're not a terrible businesswoman. You're a brilliant person. You're developing your body of work and doing things all in the right succession and being noticed by the best of people like Peter Pennoyer. And so you're a rising star, and it's so great to see. So, on behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, founded 1785, so we do know a few things, we express our gratitude to Tulis, sculptor and designer, for her participation in the General Society Artisan Lecture Series. So thank you. And because we intend to keep our eyes on you, and you were here for 4 years, so we're inviting you back with your lifetime library membership card. So that's for you.
Thank you so much for having me, and I feel really honored and encouraged by this opportunity to share what I'm working on.
Thank you. And finally, a little memento. Sorry. Of the evening. So thank you. And a General Society tote bag. Yes. I want to thank you all for coming this evening. And I just want to say one thing I did omit to say at the beginning. I want to thank our co-curator of the Artisan Lecture Series, who was Jean Ouillart, and it was at his suggestion that Abigail came and spoke this evening. So and what a wonderful suggestion it was. So thank you.